The wind was a blade, honing itself on the jagged peaks of the unforgiving mountains before descending to flay the plains. It found every crack in Alara's soul, every threadbare patch on her husband's coat which she now wore like a shroud. The canvas of their wagon, once a proud white symbol of hope, was a tattered ruin, flapping a frantic, desperate rhythm against the splintered frame. It was the sound of failure, the sound of death. Her husband, Thomas, was 3 weeks gone, buried beneath a cairn of stones she had piled with her own raw hands, a fever having stolen the light from his eyes and the promise from his lips. Now, she was alone, the vast, bleached-out sky a merciless witness to her slow demise. The oxen were gone, wandered off, or taken by wolves. The last of the flour had been a gritty paste mixed with snow 2 days ago. Hunger was a hollow ache that had long ago sharpened into a constant, gnawing pain. Despair was no longer a visitor. It was the very air she breathed, cold and thin in her lungs. She huddled behind the broken wheel, the wood biting into her back, and watched the sun bleed its last colors across the horizon. It was beautiful in a cruel, indifferent way. Another night was coming, and she did not think she would survive this one. The cold was a physical presence, seeping through her boots, crawling up her legs, a patient predator waiting for her to finally stop fighting. Her fingers were numb, clumsy things that barely felt like her own. She thought of her mother's garden, the scent of damp earth and roses, a memory so vivid it brought a fresh wave of tears that froze on her chapped cheeks. It was a world away, a life away. This brutal landscape of rock and wind and endless, empty space was her reality now. This was her grave. As the last vestiges of light faded, a flicker caught her eye. Distant, unsteady. It wasn't a star. It was too low, too yellow. A light, a lamp in a window. A tremor went through her, not of cold, but of something far more potent. A terrifying, savage spike of hope. It was madness to move, to expend the last dregs of her strength on a phantom. But it was greater madness to stay, to surrender. She pushed herself up, her joints screaming in protest. Every muscle fiber trembled with exhaustion. One step, then another. The wind tore at her, trying to push her back, to pin her to the frozen ground. But the light was a fixed point in the swirling darkness, a tiny anchor in an ocean of nothing. It might be a trapper, a hunter, a man who would see her not as a soul in need, but as a weakness to be exploited. The thought was a shard of ice in her gut. She had heard stories, but the alternative was certain death. Her hand fumbled inside her coat, her fingers closing around the cold, heavy steel of Thomas's old revolver. It held 2 bullets. Enough. The cabin, when she finally stumbled towards it, was a dark, solid shape against the snow, a bastion of crude strength. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a fragile plume instantly shredded by the wind. She was a ghost, a wraith blown in by the storm, and the life within that small structure felt a universe away from her own fading existence. She fell against the rough-hewn door, her shoulder striking the wood with a dull thud that was swallowed by the gale. There was no strength left to knock, only to lean, to hope. For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence within was as absolute as the noise without. Perhaps she had imagined it all. The light, the smoke. Perhaps she was already dead. Then, the sound of a heavy bar being lifted from inside. The door creaked open a few inches, casting a narrow spear of warm, yellow light onto the snow. A man's shape filled the opening, a silhouette immense and dark against the firelight behind him. He was tall, broad, his presence filling the entire frame. He said nothing. The silence stretched, thick with questions he did not ask and answers she could not give. She could see the glint of his eyes, watchful and unreadable. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her exhaustion. This was it. The moment her fate would be decided. She pulled the revolver from her coat. Her hand shook so violently she needed her other to steady it. The barrel wavered, pointing somewhere in the vicinity of his chest. Her voice was a dry, broken rasp, a sound she barely recognized as her own. "I have nothing left to steal," she whispered, the words torn away by the wind. "But I swear." I'll kill you if I have to, she meant it. In that fractured moment, with the last ounce of her will, she would have pulled the trigger. He stood frozen in the doorway, a statue carved from shadow and stillness. His gaze dropped from her face to the trembling gun, then back again. He did not move, did not flinch. There was no fear in his eyes, no anger. There was only a profound, unnerving quiet. He looked at her, truly looked, and seemed to see everything. The desperation, the grief, the starvation that had hollowed her out. He saw the broken woman clinging to a threat she could barely uphold. Then, slowly, he stepped back, pulling the door wider. It was not a retreat. It was an invitation. The gesture was simple, stark, and more disarming than any word he could have spoken. He was letting her in. The warmth from the cabin washed over her, smelling of wood smoke and coffee and something savory she couldn't name. It was the scent of life. The revolver suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Her arms dropped to her sides, the gun a dead weight in her numb fingers. She took one stumbling step across the threshold, and the world dissolved into blackness. She woke to the sensation of warmth, a deep, penetrating heat that felt alien and luxurious. For a moment, she thought she was in a fever dream, back in the wagon with Thomas, his body burning beside her. But this was different. This was a dry, steady warmth that came from a hearth. She was lying on a pallet of furs near a large stone fireplace where a low, healthy fire crackled, spitting embers against a metal screen. A heavy wool blanket was tucked around her, coarse but clean. Her eyes fluttered open, taking in the single room of the cabin. It was Spartan, built for function, not comfort. A sturdy table and 2 chairs stood in the center. Shelves holding tins and sacks lined one wall. On the other, a narrow cot was neatly made. The man was at the far end of the room, his back to her, tending to something on a cast-iron stove. He moved with a quiet economy, no wasted motion. He was still dressed in the dark trousers and collarless shirt from the night before. She remembered the gun. Her body tensed, her hand instinctively flying to her coat, which was draped over a nearby chair. It was empty. A jolt of panic seized her. She pushed herself up on one elbow, her head spinning with the effort. "Where is it?" she asked, her voice still rough. The man turned. In the full light of the fire, she could see him clearly for the first time. He was as imposing as he had seemed in silhouette, with broad shoulders and hands that looked strong enough to split logs with a single blow. A long, faded scar ran from his left temple down his jaw, pulling at the corner of his mouth and giving him a permanent, grim expression. His eyes, a pale, clear gray, were startling in his weathered face. He looked at her, then gestured with his head toward the high mantelpiece above the fire. The revolver was there, placed carefully, well out of reach. He had disarmed her while she was unconscious. Yet he hadn't thrown her back into the snow. He hadn't harmed her. He had brought her in, laid her by his fire, and covered her with a blanket. The contradiction was a knot in her mind she couldn't untangle. He turned back to the stove and ladled a thin broth into a wooden bowl. He walked over and set it on the floor beside her pallet, along with a cup of water. He didn't speak, just placed the offerings down and retreated to the table, where he sat, watching the fire as if she weren't there. The aroma of the broth, simple, made from salted meat and wild onions, was agonizing. It was the most beautiful smell she had ever encountered. Her pride warred with her screaming, desperate hunger. To accept his charity was to admit her complete and utter defeat. It was to place herself at his mercy. But her body had already made the decision. With trembling hands, she reached for the bowl. The wooden spoon felt clumsy in her fingers. The first sip was scalding, but she barely felt it. It was pure life, a warm river flowing through the frozen landscape of her insides. She drank it all too quickly, scraping the bottom of the bowl with the spoon. Only when it was empty did she look up at him again. He was still watching the fire, his profile rigid, unmoving. "Why?" she managed to ask. The word hung in the air between them, small and fragile. He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without turning, he spoke. His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. Winter, it was a single word, but it held a library of meaning. It spoke of shared hardship, of the universal law of survival that governed this harsh land. In the face of the great, impersonal cruelty of the coming snows, the small conflicts between two human beings were meaningless. You didn't leave a person to die in a blizzard, not even one who had threatened to kill you. It was a code, unspoken and absolute. She lay back down, pulling the blanket up to her chin. The food in her stomach was a small, warm anchor. She was still afraid, still wary of this silent, scarred man. But the terror that had been her constant companion for weeks had receded, leaving behind a vast, aching exhaustion. For the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. She was in a stranger's cabin, disarmed and utterly dependent. But she was warm, and she was alive. She closed her eyes, and sleep took her not into the blackness of oblivion, but into a deep, dreamless quiet. The days that followed unfolded in a rhythm of quiet observation. Alara's strength returned slowly, incrementally. The man, whom she learned was named Silas, never asked her name and she did not offer it. Their communication was a sparse, stark language of necessity. He would leave food for her and she would eat it. He would ensure the fire never died, and she would soak in its life-giving warmth. She watched him constantly, her gaze tracking his movements as he went about his solitary life. He was a creature of routine. At dawn, he would rise and tend to his single, sturdy horse in the small lean-to attached to the cabin. He would chop wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady heartbeat in the frozen silence of the morning. He would check his traps, sometimes returning with a rabbit or a grouse, which he would skin and prepare with an unhurried, methodical skill. He mended his own gear, a leather strap, a tear in his coat with thick, precise stitches. He was entirely self-sufficient, a man who seemed to have been carved from the very landscape he inhabited, rugged, silent, and enduring. He owned few things, but everything he had was well-maintained and purposeful. There were no decorations, no sentimental objects, save for a small, worn whittling of a bird on the windowsill, its form so smooth it must have been handled 1,000 times. Alara began to feel like a ghost in his home, a temporary specter haunting the edges of his established world. The initial fear she'd felt began to curdle into a different kind of anxiety, the unease of indebtedness. She was a burden. She ate his food, used his firewood, occupied the warmest space in his home. The knowledge chafed at her pride. She had never been dependent on anyone but Thomas, and together they had been a unit, a partnership against the world. Now she was just a stray he had taken in. One afternoon, while he was outside, she rose from her pallet, feeling more steady on her feet than she had in weeks. She looked at the disarray she had created, the furs rumpled, her own filthy coat a heap on the chair. She folded the blankets with careful, precise movements. She took her coat outside and shook it vigorously, the dust and dirt of the trail flying away in the wind. When she brought it back in, she found a needle and thread in a small tin on a shelf and began mending the torn lining. She was not as skilled as he was, her stitches small and uneven, but it was work. It was an act of putting something back in order. When Silas returned, he stopped just inside the door, his eyes taking in the neatly folded blankets and the sight of her sewing. He said nothing, but his usual stillness seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second. He carried in a fresh bucket of water from the well and set it by the stove, then went back to his own tasks. But something had shifted. A silent acknowledgement had passed between them. The next day, she found the courage to approach the stove while he was preparing the evening meal, a simple stew. She picked up a wooden spoon and began to stir, her movements tentative. He glanced at her, then stepped aside, allowing her the space. They stood for a moment in near proximity, the silence filled only by the bubbling of the pot and the crackle of the fire. It was not comfortable, but it was not hostile. It was the beginning of a shared existence, a silent negotiation of roles. She was no longer just a patient, a survivor. She was a presence in the house, contributing in the small ways she could. She learned to anticipate his needs, refilling the woodbox before it was empty, putting a pot of water on to heat when she saw him coming in from the cold. He, in turn, began to leave a small portion of the stew aside before he added the harsh peppers he seemed to favor. It was a conversation held without words, a gradual building of something fragile and unnamed in the vast, silent wilderness. The blizzard arrived without warning. One moment, the sky was a sheet of dull, gray metal. The next, the world outside the cabin's single window dissolved into a churning vortex of white. The wind howled like a banshee, clawing at the log walls and rattling the door in its frame. Snow piled in deep drifts against the cabin, sealing them in. The sound was immense, a constant, deafening roar that vibrated through the floorboards and seemed to press in on them from all sides. For 2 days they were prisoners in the small, firelit space. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin, the circle of warmth from the hearth. The enforced proximity was a heavy blanket, smothering the careful distance they had maintained. Silas seemed unaffected, his calm a stark contrast to the storm's fury. He methodically checked the seals on the window and door, reinforced the bar, and kept the fire fed with a steady supply of wood from the generous stack inside. He sat for hours at the table, sharpening his knives with a whetstone, the rhythmic shing-shing-shing a counterpoint to the wind's chaotic symphony. Alara found the confinement unnerving. The roaring wind was too much like the sound in her own head on the worst days after Thomas's death. It dredged up memories she fought to keep buried. On the second night of the storm, she was jerked from a shallow sleep by a nightmare. She was back at the wagon, the wind screaming, Thomas's breathing a ragged, hitching sound beside her. She felt his forehead, the unnatural heat of it, and in her dream, his skin crumbled to ash under her touch. She sat bolt upright on her pallet, a strangled cry caught in her throat, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cabin was dark, save for the dying, red glow of the embers in the fireplace. Across the room she could just make out Silas's shape. He was sitting up on his cot, a dark silhouette against the faint light. He had heard her. Shame washed over her, hot and swift. She was a child, waking the house with her terrors. She expected an impatient sigh, a gruff word to be quiet. Instead, there was only silence. She lay back down, pulling the blanket tight, her body trembling. She stared into the darkness, willing herself to be still, to be silent. After a few minutes, she heard a soft scraping sound, then the clink of metal. Silas moved from his cot to the stove. He worked in the near darkness, his movements sure and familiar. She heard the splash of water, the soft rustle of a tin being opened. He was making something. He approached her pallet, his large frame blocking the faint glow from the fire. She tensed, her breath catching. He knelt and placed a steaming mug on the floor beside her. He didn't say a word. He simply set it down and retreated back to his cot. The scent rose from the mug, not of coffee, but of chamomile and mint. It was an herbal tea, something to soothe and calm. Where had he even gotten it? It was a small, deliberate act of kindness, an acknowledgement of her pain that asked for nothing in return. She reached for the mug, her fingers wrapping around its warmth. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to the grim, silent man she thought he was, that it broke through a dam inside her. A single, hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of grief or fear, but of something more complex, a fragile, aching gratitude. She drank the tea slowly, its warmth spreading through her chest, quieting the frantic beating of her heart. She looked over at the still, silent shape on the cot across the room. He was a stranger, a scarred, intimidating man who lived alone at the edge of the world. But in the heart of the storm, he had offered her a moment of quiet grace. And for the first time, the fear she felt towards him began to transform into a cautious, questioning wonder. The blizzard broke as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a world transformed. The landscape was buried under a thick, pristine blanket of snow, the sun glaring off its surface with blinding intensity. The air was sharp and still, the silence profound after the storm's 2-day assault. Their supplies were running low, the sacks of flour and beans noticeably lighter. Silas spoke 2 words to her that morning, his gaze fixed on the dwindling provisions. Town. Tomorrow the thought of returning to civilization, even a rough outpost town, sent a complicated shiver through Alara. It meant facing people, questions, judgments. It meant leaving the strange sanctuary the cabin had become. But it was a necessity. The next morning, he hitched his horse to a small, sturdy sleigh he had built. He placed a few empty sacks in the back and then looked at her, a silent question in his pale eyes. He was not going to command her to come, nor was he going to forbid it. The choice was hers. Staying alone in the cabin felt like cowardice. Going with him felt like an affirmation of the tentative partnership that had formed between them. She nodded once and went to fetch her coat. The journey was cold but beautiful. The sleigh glided over the snow, the only sounds the jingle of the harness and the soft crunch of the horse's hooves. They traveled for hours, the vast white emptiness broken only by the dark shapes of distant mesas. The town, when it appeared, was little more than a single muddy street carved out of the snow, lined with a dozen false-fronted buildings. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a few ramshackle houses. Smoke plumed from every chimney, a sign of the life huddled within. As they pulled up to the general store, heads turned. Men loitering on the boardwalk stopped their conversations to stare. Their gazes were hard and curious. They looked at Silas first, their eyes lingering on the scar that marked his face. There were whispers, a slight shifting away as he looped the reins around the hitching post. He was known here and clearly not well liked. Then their eyes fell on her, sitting beside him in the sleigh. The curiosity sharpened into something else, a leering, speculative judgment. A woman, emerging from the wilderness with the silent, scarred recluse of the plains. Their imaginations, she knew, would fill in the sordid details. Silas seemed oblivious, or perhaps simply indifferent, to the stares. He moved toward the store, his stride unbroken. Alara, however, felt the heat of their scrutiny like a physical brand. She pulled her coat tighter and followed him inside, keeping her eyes fixed on the floorboards. The store was dim and smelled of cured meat, kerosene, and damp wool. The proprietor, a balding man with shrewd, beady eyes, gave Silas a curt nod and immediately began measuring out flour and beans. As Silas paid with a few worn coins, a man detached himself from a group near the stove. He was thick-set, with a florid face and an air of smug ownership. "Well, look what the storm blew in," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole store to hear. He wasn't looking at Silas. He was looking directly at Alara. "Heard you lost your husband out on the trail, ma'am. A real shame. That's a good piece of land," he claimed. Too good for a woman to work alone. The man's name was Barlow. She remembered him from the land office. He had tried to argue that Thomas's claim was invalid. His smile was predatory. "You need a real man to look after a claim like that. And to look after you." His eyes roamed over her, insolent and possessive. Before Alara could find her voice to utter a scathing reply, Silas finished his transaction. He turned, his body language utterly calm, yet he positioned himself squarely between her and Barlow. He didn't say a word to the man. He simply met his gaze. The air in the store grew thick and heavy. Barlow's smirk faltered under the weight of Silas's unwavering, silent stare. For a long moment, the two men were locked in a battle of wills. Barlow, blustering and loud. Silas, a monolith of quiet, immovable force. It was Barlow who broke first. He grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "Just making conversation," he muttered, turning away. Silas picked up their sacks. "Let's go," he said, his voice low and flat. It was the first time he had ever initiated a complete sentence to her that wasn't about a direct task. Outside, in the cold, clean air, the tension from the store still clung to her. She looked at the faces on the street, the suspicion and the judgment. She looked at Barlow, now standing on the saloon porch, watching them with narrowed eyes. and she looked at Silas, loading their supplies, his scarred face impassive. In that moment she understood. The real danger wasn't the silent man who had saved her. It was the world they had just entered. The cabin, which she had once seen as a prison, now seemed like the only safe place on earth. The encounter in town left a residue of unease that lingered in the cabin's quiet air. Alara found herself watching the horizon more, scanning the vast, empty expanse of snow for any sign of movement. The memory of Barlow's greedy eyes was a stain on the pristine landscape. Silas, too, seemed different. He was as silent as ever, but there was a new watchfulness about him. He spent more time cleaning his rifle, his movements deliberate and focused. He would stand at the window for long stretches, his gaze sweeping the plains, a sentinel guarding his tiny kingdom. He never mentioned Barlow or the confrontation, but it was a shared, unspoken weight between them. A few days later, he was splitting logs near the cabin when he suddenly went still, the axe held motionless in midair. Alara, who was inside kneading a small lump of dough, saw the change in his posture through the window. She followed his gaze. Far out, near the horizon where the skeletal remains of her wagon were a dark speck against the snow, 3 riders were visible. They were too distant to make out clearly, but she knew. Her stomach clenched into a cold knot. It was Barlow. Silas lowered the axe and came inside, his face grim. He didn't offer explanations or reassurances. He simply went to the wall where his rifle rested, took it down and checked the action. He slung a powder horn and a pouch of ammunition over his shoulder. His pale eyes met hers for a brief, intense moment. There was no fear in them, only a cold, hard resolve. He was going out to meet them. "Stay inside," he commanded. "Bar the door." The words were not a suggestion. They were an order forged from imminent danger. He turned and left without another glance, his tall frame disappearing into the blinding white of the snow-covered plains. Alara rushed to the door, her hands shaking as she dropped the heavy wooden bar into place. The sound of it falling into the brackets was deafeningly final. She was locked in, safe perhaps, but utterly helpless. She ran to the window, her breath fogging the cold glass. She watched his solitary figure trudge through the deep snow, the rifle held loosely in one hand, his stride long and purposeful. He was one man against 3, one quiet, solitary man against the loud, arrogant greed of the world. A wave of fear, more powerful than any she had felt for herself, washed over her. It was a terrifying, protective fear for him. This man who had saved her, who had shared his fire and his food, was walking into a confrontation because of her. Her presence had brought this trouble to his door. The guilt was a physical sickness. She watched until he was just a dark shape, moving steadily toward the other dark shapes in the distance. They were converging near the wreckage of her old life, the site of her deepest grief. And now it was to be the site of new violence. The cabin felt immense and empty. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was fraught with tension. Every tick of the cooling stove, every whisper of wind against the eaves, a prelude to the crack of a rifle shot. She paced the floor, from the hearth to the window and back again, her hands clenched into fists. She thought of the revolver on the mantelpiece, her gun. He had left it there. He trusted her with it. He trusted her. The thought was a stunning revelation. In the face of an external threat, he had armed her and left her to guard his home. Their silent, fragile truce had solidified into something far stronger without her even realizing it. It was trust. It was an alliance. She stopped her pacing and looked out the window again. The figures were too far away to see what was happening. She could only wait, trapped in a cage of wood and worry, listening for a gunshot that would tell her she was, once more, completely and utterly alone. The wait was an eternity stretched thin. Alara's world had shrunk to the frosted pane of the window and the distant, indistinct figures on the snow. She saw them meet, Silas's single, dark form and the 3 mounted men. Even from this distance, she could feel the tension, the confrontation in their rigid postures. They were talking, or rather, she imagined Barlow was talking. his voice carrying on the wind she could not hear. Silas would be still. He would be silent. He would let the other man's anger break against him like waves on a rock. Then the scene erupted into sudden, brutal motion. One of the riders spurred his horse forward. There was a flash, not of a gunshot but of sunlight on metal. A rifle barrel. Silas moved with a speed that belied his size, diving to the side as a puff of white smoke erupted from the rider's gun. The sound reached her a second later, a flat, ugly crack that echoed across the plains. Her heart leaped into her throat. He was down. No, he was moving, rolling in the snow, bringing his own rifle up. Another shot rang out, this one deeper, heavier, his. One of the horses reared, screaming, and its rider tumbled from the saddle. The third man, who she assumed was Barlow, charged forward. Silas was on his feet again, but he was slower, favoring one side. He'd been hit. He met Barlow's charge not with another shot, but with the stock of his rifle, a brutal, close-quarters fight. The third man was scrambling for his fallen weapon. It was chaos, a desperate, ugly brawl in the middle of a vast, indifferent wilderness. Alara could not just stand there. She could not wait to see the outcome. The bar on the door felt impossibly heavy as she lifted it, her muscles straining. She grabbed the revolver from the mantelpiece, its cold weight a familiar, terrible comfort in her hand. She didn't have a plan. She only knew she couldn't stay hidden while he fought a battle that was hers. She burst from the cabin, the frigid air a shock to her lungs. The snow was deep, slowing her down, each step a desperate plunge. She ran, stumbling, falling, picking herself up again, the revolver clutched in her fist. The fight was already ending. As she drew closer, she saw Barlow on the ground, clutching his arm. The other man was helping his friend, who was groaning on the snow. Silas stood over them, his rifle aimed steadily. His face was a mask of cold fury. "Get off this land," Silas's voice carried across the snow, low and dangerous. "If I see you again, I won't miss." Barlow scrambled to his feet, his face contorted with pain and rage. He spat on the snow. This ain't over, recluse, but his threat was empty. He and his men gathered themselves, mounted their horses and rode away, a trail of blood drops staining the pristine white behind them. They were beaten. They were gone. Silas stood watching them go, his posture rigid. Only when they were distant figures on the horizon did he finally lower the rifle. And then he swayed, his body slumping as he pressed a hand to his side. His shirt was dark with blood. Alara finally reached him, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. "You're hurt," she said, the words stupid and obvious. He looked at her, his pale eyes clouded with pain. He seemed surprised to see her there, outside the cabin, holding the gun. He gave a short, grim nod. The strength that had held him upright seemed to desert him all at once. He took a staggering step, then another, his gaze fixed on the cabin, on home. He was leaning heavily on his rifle like a crutch. She moved to his side, her fear replaced by a sharp, clear focus. She put her shoulder under his arm, taking on his weight. He was heavy, a dead weight of exhausted muscle and bone, but she braced herself, her feet solid in the snow. "Come on," she said, her voice firm, steady. "Let's get you inside." He didn't protest. He leaned on her, and together, they began the slow, painful journey back to the cabin. The roles were reversed. He, the strong protector, was now wounded and vulnerable. And she, the broken survivor, was now the one providing support. In the bloody snow, surrounded by silence, a new contract was forged between them. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, agonizing ordeal. Silas leaned heavily on her, each step a testament to his immense pain and her newfound resolve. The smell of his blood was sharp and metallic in the cold air. Once inside, he collapsed onto the pallet of furs by the fire, the one that had been her sickbed. His face was pale, beaded with sweat despite the cabin's chill, his breathing shallow. The wound was on his left side, a ragged tear in his shirt and the flesh beneath, staining the dark fabric an even darker crimson. For a moment, Alara felt a surge of the old panic, the helplessness she'd felt watching Thomas fade away. But she forced it down. This was not the same. Silas was a fighter, and she would not let him die. She moved with a purpose she didn't know she possessed. "I need to see it," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. He nodded, his eyes closed. With trembling but determined fingers, she cut away the bloody fabric of his shirt. The bullet had torn a furrow along his ribs, a deep, ugly graze, but it seemed to have passed through without lodging deep inside. It was bleeding freely, but it could have been so much worse. Relief, fierce and sharp, made her dizzy. "Water," she commanded herself as much as him. She stoked the fire, adding logs until it roared, then set a pot of water to boil. She tore strips from one of her few clean petticoats, creating makeshift bandages. She searched his shelves, finding a small tin of antiseptic salve that smelled of pine tar and a bottle of raw, potent whiskey. He watched her through half-closed eyes, his usual impenetrable stillness replaced by a stark vulnerability. He was at her mercy now, just as she had been at his. She brought the basin of hot water, the clean cloths, and the whiskey. "This will hurt," she stated simply. He gave another short nod, his jaw tight. She cleaned the wound as gently as she could, her touch surprisingly steady. He flinched when she poured the whiskey over it, a sharp hiss of breath escaping his lips, but he made no other sound. His control was absolute even in agony. She applied the salve and then wrapped the bandages tightly around his torso, the movements awkward but effective. When she was finished, her hands were stained with his blood. She sat back on her heels, exhausted. He was pale, but his breathing was a little deeper. He had survived the immediate danger. Now began the slow work of healing. She made him a thin broth, the same kind he had first made for her, and held the bowl for him as he drank. He managed only a few sips before turning his head away. She covered him with the heavy wool blanket and then sat in the chair by the fire, the revolver resting on the table beside her. Night fell, and the cabin was silent except for the crackling of the logs and the soft sound of Silas's breathing. She did not sleep. She watched over him, her gaze fixed on the rise and fall of his chest. He was no longer the intimidating stranger, the scarred recluse. She had seen his strength, and now she had seen his weakness. She had touched his wound, bound his injury. In cleaning his blood, she had washed away the last of her fear of him. He was just a man who had stood between her and the world's ugliness, and had paid a price for it. A profound shift had occurred within the log walls of the cabin. The balance of power had not just been leveled, it had been dissolved. What was left was something more elemental. Two people, bound by shared hardship and a debt of life paid in both directions. She looked at his face, peaceful in sleep, the harsh lines softened by exhaustion, the scar a pale map of old pains, and she felt not gratitude, not debt, but a fierce, protective tenderness that was as surprising as it was powerful. Winter began its slow retreat, surrendering the land inch by painful inch. The iron grip of the frost loosened, and the snow began to melt under a sun that held a new, genuine warmth. Water dripped from the eaves of the cabin in a steady, rhythmic patter, a sound of liberation. The plains were transformed into a muddy, brown tapestry patched with stubborn islands of white. Silas's wound healed. Alara tended to it daily, changing the dressings, her touch growing more confident. He bore her ministrations with his usual stoicism, but the rigid set of his shoulders had softened. He allowed her to help him, a surrender that was, for him, a greater act of trust than facing down 3 armed men. The silence between them changed as well. It was no longer a space of caution and observation, but one of comfort and understanding. They moved around the small cabin in a familiar orbit, a partnership that needed no words to define it. One afternoon, as she rebandaged his side, he spoke, his voice quiet. "The claim is yours. Barlow won't be back." It was a statement of fact, but it was also a promise. He was acknowledging her past and securing her future. "It's just land," she replied, her fingers stilling on the bandage. "It's not a home." Her gaze drifted around the cabin. The stone hearth, the worn table, the rifle resting in its place. This was the only home she had known since her world had fallen apart. He looked at her, his pale gray eyes holding an unreadable expression. It could be the words were simple, freighted with unspoken meaning. It was not a declaration, but an offering. Possibility. He was giving her a choice, the one thing that had been stolen from her for so long. She finished tying the bandage and met his gaze, a quiet strength settling deep within her. The broken, desperate woman who had stumbled to his door threatening murder was gone. In her place was someone else, someone forged in the crucible of loss and survival, someone who had learned the difference between solitude and loneliness. She had come here seeking refuge from the wilderness, only to find that the truest wilderness was the cruelty of other people, and the safest harbor was in the company of a silent, scarred man. He had seen her at her most vulnerable and had not taken advantage. She had seen him wounded and had not abandoned him. Their bond was not one of passion or romance, but something deeper, quieter, and more resilient, rooted in the shared soil of hardship and mutual respect. Standing together by the window one evening, they watched the last of the sun's light paint the thawing landscape in hues of gold and lavender. The world was waking up, and so were they. "My name is Alara," she said softly into the quiet. He turned to her, a faint, almost imperceptible softening at the corner of his mouth, the side untouched by the scar. "I know," he said, and in that simple admission, she understood he had known all along. He had given her the time and space to claim her own name again in her own time. The future was as vast and uncertain as the plains stretching before them, but for the first time, it did not feel empty. Felt like a beginning. The air was still cold, but it held the promise of spring. It was the scent of hope,